Good morning, good morning. How is everyone doing? Where's everybody tuning in from today? Hi, Monica. How are you? I am finally treating myself to a new one of my brushes today. I just realized, I've been using the same brush for almost a year now because I started testing it even before I started selling them. And I haven't been particularly nice, and I've been painting 2 or 3 paintings a day, and so I decided to treat myself to a new one. Hi, hi, hi. Is that South Africa? Trying to remember what flag that is. Moogie has just laid down to take a nap next to me while we're painting. Today we're going to be working on, I don't know how many of you saw this video, but we're going to be working on these skills in more detail today, and so we're going to be doing practice today. And this one's really fun, and I kind of want to play with it some more, as well as I want to explain a little bit more in depth on some of the things that can be really helpful. So if you want to do this, you'll need a couple pieces of paper. You're going to need some paints, obviously, and then you're going to need some scissors and some sort of glue. Good morning. Beautiful day to watercolor in Kansas. Nice. Oh, I'm sorry you weren't feeling well, Monica. I'm glad you're feeling better. Let's do a time check. We got about 2 more minutes, so go ahead and grab what you need for today before we get started. As far as your paper choices that you're going to do today, I'm going to be working on this one here. Yeah, practicing skills is kind of fun, and sometimes it's nice to do something with them. But I'm going to be using this. This is just from Michaels. It's 140-pound paper. It says it's cold pressed, but it's actually really, really smooth, so I don't really qualify this one as a cold pressed paper. It's not one of my nicest papers since I am going to be practicing, but it's thick enough where it still has some of the same effects and it doesn't warp too much while I'm working on stuff. So I'm going to be using something like this. You might want to practice either on something that you don't care about as much, or if you've got a new paper where you want to kind of explore some of how it works, this might be a good one too. We'll need about 3 pages today. Anybody have any fun plans for the day? Or for this weekend? All right, it is officially 11, so let me introduce myself. For those of you who don't know, my name is Lacey. I'm the artist behind Rebel Unicorn Crafts, and we do live watercolor classes every other week here. Today we're going to be doing a practice type session where we're going to be practicing some different skills. Specifically today, we're going to be talking about water control a bit, as well as how to play with wet on wet versus wet on dry techniques. And you don't need to be perfect in any of these things. We're going to be able to select from the best of them in order to make our fun little snake plant leaves. We'll be doing a few different brush control exercises so that we can get to know our brushes a little bit better. And then we'll be doing just some kind of experimentation with some blooms and things like that for the background. Let's see what you guys are doing today. COVID, oh no, I hope you feel better soon. Packing, oh, that's stressful. I hope your move goes smoothly. Family coming, nice, hanging around, working in your garden. Those sound like nice plans other than the COVID and packing. Those two I would prefer not to do. All right, so let's actually get started today. I've grabbed 2 different sets of watercolors because also I want you guys to see some of the different effects depending on different paints. I do have mine here, and also I don't know did anybody else see that video where somebody cleaned their watercolor palette for their daughter before they came home from college? I spent an hour doing that to these. And now I'm going to mess it up today, but it was very satisfying doing it. I don't know if you can tell how much cleaner it is. I even cleaned out each one of the pans. Just returned from a sunrise? Nice. Oh, well, I'm so glad you're here to do some art. Crochet. Hi. Eating strawberries. Yum, yum, yum. I'm having my smoothie this morning. So I'm going to first spray these. If you're using some sort of dried paint pans, now is a great time to give them a good spritz. I need to grab my spritzer. You just got out your paint. That's perfect. You want to buy the succulent picture? I might list some of these on my website, but you can also just follow along so that you can make your own today. So today we're doing this practice session thing where I'm going to talk in more detail because obviously in less than 3 minutes I can't explain everything that I was hoping for you guys to learn in this, so I want to go over this in more detail. If you're newer to watercolor, spraying your paints before you actually get started and letting them sit for a little bit is going to give you better access to the pigments, so I always recommend doing that. In addition to these ones that I'm going to be using today, just so you guys can see some different effects, I will also be throwing in some colors from the Viviva color sheets so that we can just see how they behave. You went on a float trip? Fun. Using 2 palettes. This is mine. This is the Unicorn Food palette, and then the Viviva one. Whatever ones you have are going to be totally fine for this. A lot of this practice session is getting to know your paints, your brushes, and just kind of how you personally work with stuff. I made juice today. Yum. Yum, yum, yum. All right, so I'm going to open up this first page here. Let me see what's in frame. And I'm going to have to be a little risky and actually place my palette on here just because usually I try to work on smaller things so that you guys can see more. But today, obviously, we want to actually kind of take advantage of most of this page. For each one of the exercises, we're going to be using about 3 pages of paper. Again, I mentioned at the beginning, I'm finally treating myself to a new one of my brushes because I've been using the other one for about a year now and painting 2 to 3 times a day, and not always being the nicest to it, so I finally decided to replace it. So I'm going to go ahead and give mine a wash out. In case you didn't know, when you get new brushes, they're usually a little crispy feeling. And what happens to them is before they're shipped out, they're coated in kind of like a starchy type solution. It's almost like a hairspray for the brush just so that they're better in shipping. So you always want to wash it out before you use a new brush. Just a quick swirl around in some water. Let's mix up a nice darker green color with my palette. My palette has more of an army green and a light green. If you already have a darker green, that's totally fine. For the yellow, I will probably be primarily dipping into these, maybe watering it down a little bit. But let's start by mixing up a green color. I have not used chalk pastels over watercolor. That sounds like fun, though. I've been working on, if we have time at the end, need to be a little more disciplined about time today, but I can show you the sketchbook I'm working on that's really mixed media that's fun. All right, so in order to get a nice dark green color, we have a couple different paths we can go here. We can either go from some blues and yellows to make a nice green, or we could start with a green base and then modify it with the blues and yellows. I'm going to put a little water in here. Let's start with blues and yellows. I'm going to take a little bit of this one. My palette is Blueberry Muffin. It is most similar in other palettes to a Prussian or an ultramarine type blue. I'm also going to grab some of this blue raspberry, which is most similar in other palettes to a phthalo blue. I'm going to grab these 2 colors here. I'm going to grab a tester strip too, just so that you can see kind of as I mix how the colors change, because this is another really good skill to have, is mixing up colors. Then I'm going to grab this, which is in my palette, what's this one called? This one's Banana Split, and it's most similar to a yellow ochre color. I'm going to mix some of that in. And now we're kind of at a tealish, ooh, that's mainly in my brush. Let's actually mix that in. There we go, more of a tealish type color. And you can see I'm not getting a great amount of saturation, and part of that is I didn't dry my brush off very well in between washing it, so I introduced more water to it. So I just need to kind of go again. I'm going to grab some of the other yellow in here as well. This is more like a medium yellow. And let's just check on that. Now we're at a nice bright green color, and I want this to be a little bit darker. So again, I'm going to grab some more of this blue raspberry. All right. A little too far to the other side. Sometimes it takes a bit to get to the right tone. A little more of this yellow. And I think we should be pretty much where I want to be now. There we go. I would maybe want this to be a little more saturated. I put quite a bit of water in there, but we can definitely start with this. So we're going to be making these dart type shapes. They don't need to be perfect. You can kind of make some go to the other side. I don't know if anybody else has a snake plant, but they are a really easy shape to paint. So that's why we're going to do that, and we're going to play with a few different things. So the first thing I want us to do is we're going to work kind of in some layering. So this is going to be wet on dry. So I'm going to take some of this green, and I'm just going to make a couple strokes. Again, they don't need to be perfect. 2 strokes like this. And let's just let that one sit like that. Let's do another one in a smaller format, maybe change the shape just a bit. And maybe we'll do one in the other direction, just to see if you like holding your brush in a different way. All right, while those are drying, I'm going to mix up a slightly diluted solution just so I have easier access to this bright yellow color. I'm not going to put as much in. I'm just going to put a little spritz of water here. I'm going to grab a little of this bright yellow color and just mix that in, just so I have more of it. And let's check on that. So yeah, that's a nice saturation of that. Sometimes the snake plants have green on the outside, sometimes they've got yellow on the outside, so I'm going to do the same thing I just did over here with some of these other colors. Play around with kind of wiggling your brush on some. See which direction you like to hold it. You might also want to make some little or smaller ones too, just so we can kind of fill in some gaps. These ones we're going to be layering on, and you can also see another thing here. So one other thing I want you to kind of pay attention to is how you apply the color. On these two, I had a nice even coat of that color, whereas this one I used a lot more water in the beginning and it actually settled towards the top, which is going to give us this background. Sometimes that can be really beautiful, but it can also be really frustrating. So you might want to play around with how much water you're actually holding in your brush or color and stuff, because it's going to change these types of effects. Okay. Let me just double check on those. I'm sorry you're sick. All right, so we can let those sit for a minute. We can do a couple different things to those. This is not a very saturated color. I am going to bump this up. I need to just grab some more of all those pigments again, because I am not super satisfied with the saturation level. I want it to be brighter. So I'm going to grab some of that blue raspberry. When I wash my brush off between colors, I'm going to really be swiping it over to the side to make it nice and dry so that, well, I mean, it's still technically damp, but where there's not water contained in the center of this. And then I'm actually going to get a little of this, I call it guacamole in my palette, but it's kind of like an army green or a sap type green. And let's put a little of that in there too. You're teaching summer school? Oh, cool. Yeah. I love hearing when teachers use some of these little lessons I do. So that's already a little better. I'm going to add in a little bit more of each of those. Again, I'm going to dry my brush in between, so I'm not adding more water to this. If you just started with a little bit less water to begin with, this will be easier for you. I just put a little bit too much in for what I actually need to do today. Let's add in a little more of that green. And let's give it a good check. All right, there we go. That's much better saturation for what I want to do. While we're letting these dry for a second, I'm going to kind of talk about the next thing we're going to do, which is going to be a wet on wet. So I'm actually going to wash my brush, and I'm going to make these little dart shapes with my brush just with water. And you're going to have a hard time seeing this other than the fact that my brush is a little bit dirty. But we want to put some water down, and then we want to take these colors, and while it's still wet, we want to drop them in along the edges. Just like this. Perhaps then taking some of this yellow and dropping it in. See what happens when you drag it versus when you kind of tap it in. You're going to get different effects. We can even put a little layer in here like this. Now you're going to have different effects happening in this depending on your saturation level, how much water you're using. If you're using a different palette, your colors are probably going to bleed together a little bit differently. So if yours is not turning out exactly the same, that's totally fine. We're going to do a bunch of these. We just want to get a bunch of different effects. And this is what's going to kind of make it look a little bit like a snake plant. I'm going to do another one of those, putting that water in there, in that dart shape. I'm going to start with the yellow on the outside. One other thing you can play with is placing this pigment right on the edges where some of it is hitting the dry paper and some of it is not. It'll give you different saturations of this. I had a lot of bleeding of that yellow in the middle. You can always, while it's still nice and wet, grab a dry your brush off and then just tap this out. That will help remove some of that. Then I'm going to grab some of this green. And again, play with what happens when you drag it versus when you drop it or when you pick your brush up. If you really want to get more saturation, you can just drop in one or two areas. Let's actually drop a little bit more down the middle here. And let's grab a little more of that yellow too. Now, if you're happy with how things look, you can leave them like this, but you can also play with, okay, so this is sat for a bit. It's not completely dry, but let's just say hypothetically, what would happen if I tried to drop in some more water here? In some areas, or more color, in some areas it's really going to take that well. And in other areas, this might be a little bit too dry for this. So I'm going to be lightly tapping these. Play with the timing of this. All these different little tests are going to help you get to know your paints a little bit better. How do you know if you're happy with it or keep going? Really just personal preference. Do you like how it looks? Are you interested in how things are happening? You can always layer over too once it's dry, so feel free to do that. It really is just going to be a personal preference. These don't need to be perfect. Snake plant leaves are very different. They all look a little bit different. So you can have a lot of variation in these. Your too much gene is too much. Yes, a lot of these tests or a lot of these little practice things are kind of a test to see if you've got the too much gene. All right, let's take a little break from these and let's revisit these ones up here because these ones are pretty much dry. So we can also play around with layering. These are ones that we placed on here. And on one of these, I'm just going to grab some of this yellow and swipe it down the middle. And you can see how much of a different effect you're going to get. You could also layer on this green color right there. And we could wait for that to dry. Let's wait for that one to dry before we add the yellow on it. On this one, let's add both of those colors on top of this dry layer. And just see what happens. You normally think just a little bit more and then end up hating it. Yes, so that is one good thing to learn, is to walk away. Like right now, this one I really like. I kind of wish that there was a little more yellow in here, but I feel like if I fuss with it anymore, I'm going to lose some of the definition, so I'm not going to touch that one. This one I might touch some more. And let's play with this one too. Do kind of the same things on these ones, although I'm going to do a really light outline of this on the outside. Just like that. You can also play with, on these, so this is dry, this one here is dry. If I were to place water on top of this, I can combine the two methods. So now I've got that one in place, but I have wet the paper, and now I can have some of this, the bleeding that's going to happen on the inside. But I'll still have those nice defined yellow areas in the middle. Remember that as you add color down, if you wash your brush and dry it off, you can always suck up some of that to help you give a little more definition to the placement. But it does soften it. All right, so let's just continue to play with these. Experiment. This is a really, really good time to do some experimentation. What happens if you take straight from the pan? How much more concentration while it's still wet can you have? Can we get more variation? Let's say, hypothetically, this one is still a little wet. Let's say we wanted to get some of those little like stripes in there. Can you, at certain times, add those in depending on how wet or dry? You have it. And you kind of can. Here, to get a little variation, I'm going to do the same thing with that green. To give it kind of a striping type effect. My brush is fairly clean when I'm changing color. I'm not going to say it's totally clean. The other thing that we're actually practicing here is we're getting a head start on our brush control. So if you've noticed when I'm painting, when I'm doing these long strokes, I'm actually using different pressure. So I'm taking my brush and I'm just resting the tip down. And then I need a little more in my brush to do this better. I am pushing and pulling as I go down. And I'm kind of letting the brush do a lot of the work for me. You can play around with how hard you push down, how light you push down. We can also, once we put those in here, once you put that color down, while it's still wet, the middle isn't wet though, you can put some water just to, and also it will push away some of this, which will create some interesting effects and give you some of these little backgrounds and blooms. So I do dry the brush in general a little bit over here on the side. You guys can't really see that. It's hard to keep all this in frame. But over on the side, in between washing my brush, I'll wash it, and then I just tap it off over here to the side. This is a size 12. And I actually have it, so it's a paper towel I have on top of another towel, just because during class, since I'm demonstrating so many things, I use a lot, and so I can use less paper towel, and then the dish towel underneath it works pretty well at helping absorb more. I find that dish towels are not quite as absorbent as paper towels, so that's why I like to use the combo. And then I actually usually let these dry out after I'm done, and I can reuse these multiple times. Yes, I totally agree. The brush sizes are kind of like different things. So this is a size 12, and it is close to a 12. I would say it's also close to like a 10. I'm trying to look and see. Hold on. Other brushes I have. Yes. So this is a different type of brush. This one is not one that I sell. This is another one I like, but not one I typically recommend to beginners. So this is a silver black velvet brush, and the bristles are a little bit harder to control. I really like this brush if you're looking for looseness, but it can be really frustrating for a beginner. But you can see this is a size 10 next to a size 12, so they are pretty similar. This one's a little bit thicker than this one. Do I have any paints that I recommend? It kind of depends. I mean, I will just say I am a little biased. If you are in the US, I do sell these. These are Unicorn Food Palette. These are ones that I like. But if you are not in the US, Koi are a pretty good beginner set. I would recommend them. All right, I'm going to move down, and I'm just going to do a bunch more of these. Experiment with these, because we're not going to use every single one of these. So one of the good things we can do when we are practicing is take some of the pressure off. We know we don't need to use each one of these. We're probably going to need about 8-ish good ones, but they all don't need to be perfect. So if you mess up on a couple of these, it is not a big deal. You can play with a couple other colors. I'm going to drop in some of these colors here. And also, leaving things to walk away and observe, these are going to change. Notice how much some of these have changed as we have just kind of sat here. I'm also going to switch over to the Viviva color sheets because they do work different. So you guys can see these. There are some other colors, like other watercolors kind of like this, that are more like a dye based. And they have a ton more pigment. They are absolutely stunning, but they don't lift as well. So you notice when I was lifting things out here, I was able to actually kind of lift and control a little bit more. You've got less control over these, but you have more pigment. So let's actually take a look at these. And the way these work is it's this little packet, and the colors are on here, and you can just grab the colors directly from there. And they do come with this little side wax paper thing where you can mix colors up kind of on the fly on the side. And just check in to see if there are any new comments I need to address. Okay. Yeah, I paint with acrylic a lot too, but painting with watercolor can be so satisfying in some ways. So we're going to do the same things we did with the previous ones, and you're going to see a big difference in color, and you can get a lot more concentration from, well, my palette, but other palettes too if you don't mix up this type of a solution. But you get better effects with wet on wet and things like that when you have more of a solution kind of mixed up. So keep in mind, we're going to see different effects here. So let's put down some of this. I'm just going to go straight from these in here to begin with. So I'm just going to wiggle my brush around on these, and let's just see. So we get a lot more pigmentation if we leave that there. And let's do another one. And then let's see about lifting. We can lift this one a little bit, but it's really dyed the area underneath. So we can't get as much of the white back, so you are a little more committed. Thankfully, the greens are a little more forgiving. Like, you cannot really lift the pinks or the yellow or the blues in here, but they are stunning. So you can get a different color there. And then let's try dropping in some of that yellow. Everybody's going to have slightly different preferences when it comes to watercolor, both in how to apply it, in the types of supplies they like using, and you might find that you end up liking different things depending on what you're painting or kind of the watercolor phase that you're going through. The paper ones, so these claim to have about the same amount of pigment as a half pan of one of these. And I would say they're close. I would say it's closer to like a third of a pan because I do run out of these colors faster than the other ones, but there's a lot more in these than it looks. I've been using this one. Well, I have actually like 2 or 3 sets of these that I was testing. So I've gone between 2 or 3 of them for about 8 months, and I'm out of a couple colors in these, but not completely out of any of them. Yeah, we're experimenting with a couple different things. And watercolors also dry lighter as we go on, so you're going to notice that even these are going to fade just a little bit. We can go back and add more layers, which is another thing we're going to play with. Let's play with these colors just a bit more. And let's also do some of the wet on wet with the Viviva colors here. Just putting a couple pieces of water down or a couple strokes of water. And let's see how these bleed with the different colors. I'm going to grab some of this green that's already on my palette here, just to get some variation. And you can see these bleed in a slightly different fashion. Let's drop ooh, I dropped more water than expected there. But that's going to have some interesting results, so that's totally fine. These are all really low pressure stakes things. I'm going to grab some more of that yellow because I feel like this needs more. And this is Michael's. They're just very basic watercolor palette or watercolor paper. I'm going to grab a different yellow too. Ooh, that one's a lot darker. Let's lift a little bit of that out. So if you can't tell, these ones are a little more unpredictable. I do really like the pigment, but they have a little more unpredictable effects, which can be really fun to play with. I love using these for sunsets and things like that. But they can be kind of tricky. We just want to play. Give yourself permission to mess up on some of these. Give yourself permission to kind of just experiment on a couple of them. Remember, not all of these need to be perfect. And technically they don't need to be perfect at all because they're these little plants. All right. While we have these sitting here, these other ones are dry enough where we can do some layering on top of them, where you can do some compensating. So something like this. I like this one in general, although I do wish that there were some of these like background type effects in it. So I'm going to, on top of this one, I also want to bump up the pigment in general, and by layering on top, it's going to do that. I'm going to place some water down. And I'm just going to kind of add in more of these colors along the edges. In the middle, and let's also bump up that yellow. I'm going to go straight into the yellow this time. And this can be really fun to play with because see how we've got those 2 different layers. One is real free-flowing, and the other one is you can still see the definition between the 2 layers. So it's going to give us some depth. I'm going to do the same thing on this one. Hello, hello. And let's go ahead and do kind of a similar thing with this one here too. I just want to bump up the pigment on some of these. I'm not going to do too much to this one because I like some of the effects in the middle here. But I want the outsides to be a little more yellow. And I want the inside right down here, kind of towards the base, to be a little darker. And I'm just going to let that sit, and it's going to kind of flow and do its own thing. Some of you might like a slightly more graphic type style, so you might find that you actually just like to layer on top of layers that are already dry and kind of leave them to be. Let's put some yellow in this one. And let's put a little more of this green on the outsides. How's everybody doing? Have you done some experimenting that you normally maybe wouldn't? It's working? Nice. And then I do try to upload these. I think I still owe you guys. Oh my gosh, I've been so behind lately. I'm really sorry, guys. I've been really behind on uploading stuff. And you can also layer different types of paints on top of each other. So feel free to play around with that too. These are going to get cut out. You've got a lot of pooling. So if you are struggling, let's say I'm going to work on this one. So let's say I put this one in and I have got just a ton of water in here. This is another good thing to play with. I'm just going to put a bunch of water. Depending on how you work, you're going to work either really kind of wet or really kind of dry, and this is going to take you a while to get used to it. So if you've got way too much water in here, I'm going to try to do some of these same effects before. So let's say I put this in here. If you're having yours kind of look like this, where if I move this page around, see how that's just going to move everything with it. You might have a little bit too much water. Now, you will actually get some interesting effects because the watercolor is going to kind of settle around the edges and you're going to get a really interesting outline. But it can be really, really hard to control. So if you are somebody who, when you're looking at yours, you're going, this is not working, dry your brush off. So tap it on a paper towel or on a rag. Then you're just going to run your brush kind of along the edges or wherever there's a bunch of this. You can even just kind of tap it off and then just suck up a little bit of that extra pigment or the extra water here to help you kind of control. So these are the exact things. If you're struggling with this, that's actually a good thing to struggle in this lesson because this is what we're trying to get to know. And then see, once I add in that color again, now that I've removed some of that extra water that was just kind of sitting there, it's not going to move as much. So you can play with that too. All right, I'm going to just count these. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I'm going to do a couple more. Let's try to vary the shape of these just a little bit, so get a couple little smaller ones. I'm actually going to make the whole thing green on this one. And I'm going to drop some of this yellow right in here while it's wet. Let's do another one. Another little one here. And let's drop some of the green on the inside. Oh, well, I guess I'm going to keep messing with that one. Okay. Now, I'm going to let these ones sit to the side because I do want them to dry enough to actually be able to use them in the next round. If I were doing this another time, I would probably actually, you know what? No, I'm going to mess with this one some more. Sorry. I'm going to put some water down on this one. I just want a little more saturation on this one. So I'm going to put some water down. I'm going to do the same things. I'm going to grab some of that yellow, place this right along the edges and in the center here. And then some of that green that we mixed up. Just drop that in there. There we go. I like that one better now. Now I'm going to set this to the side, and for me that means I'm actually going to take this whole page off. Remember, make a bunch of these. These do not all need to be perfect. We're not going to use all of them. We're going to pick our favorites. The other thing you can do, if you wanted to take note at this point, is you could write some notes on some of these where you could say things like, this is 2 layers. This was wet on wet. Because these might kind of change and settle in a little bit different depending on how much water you have. And so it might be kind of interesting for you to know what you did before we move on. You might want to take a moment to actually kind of note some of those. How do I know a good brush to use? You want to look for one that is, usually I suggest getting something like a size 10 or 12, and then you just want a round brush that has a nice tip on it because you're going to be able to do a ton, which is actually a really good transition into our next thing that we're going to do. And this one, you don't need to do any specific colors, so we're going to be working on some brush skills, and you're going to be able to choose an area that you like. We can do whatever colors we want on this because we're just going to be using them for the planter type thing. Does anybody have any requests for colors for brushwork? Maybe pick 2 colors. You can see more of my work on my TikTok page, or I have a link in my profile to my website. I also have an Instagram too, and a YouTube. All right, suggestions are we got some blues, pinks, red, purple. I like the idea of purple. Okay, I'm seeing a lot of pink, purple, and then there's some for like blues and turquoise, which is actually kind of perfect because we can do the other color in the background. So maybe we'll do kind of a similar thing, but let's do pinks and purples here. And I'm going to wipe out at least this one here. So usually what I will do is I can just take my paper towel and just kind of wipe out some of that pigment if this is where it's wet from kind of drying that brush off. And we can work directly from our palette if we want to, or we can mix up some colors. I'm going to mix up some colors just so I can show you some variation in how to change some of these. So I'm going to put a little water in there. And then I'm going to show you, somebody said a dusty pink. So on some of these we'll work directly from a pink, but let's make a more dusty pink. So if we were to take something really bright, like this in my palette is called Bubblegum. And it's a super bright pink color. But to get it kind of dusty, we're going to want to mute that color. So we want to use one that's on the opposite side of the color wheel from it, which is going to be a little bit of this green. We just want to take a little bit of that. We're going to mix in a little bit of this. Notice that when I'm trying to take in little bits of this, I'm kind of putting them over onto my palette first. This is going to mute this color a little bit. We want to work a little at a time, and you can see how it's kind of gotten a little bit dustier. This might be a nice color here. And I'll mix up another color in a minute, but the brush strokes that I want us to practice are a few. I mean, technically, feel free to practice any brush strokes that you want, but let's practice making thin lines. So one of the keys here is going to be knowing how much pigment you have in your brush. If you've got a brush with a nice tip, but you've got too much pigment in here, look, it's kind of hard to make a thin line because it's going to drip on there. But if I were to pick this up with my brush and kind of tap off a little of this pigment, then I'm going to be able to make, well, if my hand will cooperate, let's find out. I can make a much finer line. So I want you to practice making some lines. Make them as thin as you can. This will also help you get to know how much pigment you need in your brush to make a full stroke too. I'm able to get quite a few strokes in there versus if I were to take way too much pigment in, then I'm not going to be able to make as much of a defined stroke. But that's also a good stroke to practice, and it's also going to pool on one side, whereas these other ones are not going to pool. Let's mix up another color because I want to be able to kind of intermix some of these. So the other one was going to be a purple. Oh, well, we're getting some running into this one, so I'm going to grab a paper towel because I think this is green and that pink running in there. I don't want all of that in there. And there is a purple in here, which I like, but let's just, since we're doing some color mixing today, and I like to make sure that I show you guys as many things as possible in these classes, let's mix up a pink color. I'm actually going to take some of my blue raspberry, which is kind of like that phthalo blue color, put that in here. And then if you take this pink to mix this up, this bubblegum color, we can get a really kind of vibrant purple color too. One of my favorite ways to make purples is to mix a pink and a blue, not a red and a blue. The brand of brushes I'm using right now are my brushes. I call this brush the Wonder Brush because I have one size, because you really only need one brush to do pretty much everything. I mean, if you like other brushes, and I am working on maybe thinking about some other brushes, but I use this brush for 98% of what I paint with watercolor. So just because of how versatile it is, because you can do really fine detail work with it. So that's another thing you can kind of practice with this, is see how thin and small of strokes you can make with your brush. Whatever you're using, you might not have as nimble of a brush, and that's totally fine. 90% of learning a new art medium is getting to know your supplies. So if you're working with different supplies, that's totally fine. Just try them out. All right, I'm going to do some more thin strokes here. Ooh. The other thing I'm doing here to get these really thin strokes is I'm actually kind of bracing myself on the table and my paper, which is giving me some stability. So we want to do thin strokes. Then we want to do what I like to think of as a medium stroke. So we're going to meet the taper of the brush to the page, and you're going to need more color in your brush for this. And we want to do a stroke across to get a nice medium stroke. Medium stroke. I'm just adding a little bit of pink in as I go down here, so it's going to give me a little bit of a gradient. Not washing my brush out. That looks kind of cool. Also, see how this is pulling away here? I think I've got some oil on my hand here where I was kind of resting it or tapping, and that's what's happening there. So when I'm thinking about how much brush do you put in the water, how much water do you put in your brush, I load it up. But you'll notice that if you load it up too much, you're going to get this initial drip of water. And so if I tap off my brush, that will release that. And then that's where I usually have my brush loaded up to. Unless I'm making those really thin lines, if I'm making the really thin lines, I usually take a tester strip and kind of knock a little bit of that out before doing that. The other thing we can do is let's play with varying the pressure weight. So take your brush, drag it lightly, push down, pull, lift up, push, pull, lift up, push, pull, lift up. This is another really good skill to have. I'm going to do the same thing here, offsetting these just a little bit. So we are just practicing brush skills. Now these are going to come in handy. We're going to be able to select an area of this that we like. Again, I'm going to do that one more time. Maybe one more time. One more time. Let's see if I can not mess this up. There we go. And then the final brush strokes that we can kind of practice instead of doing long strokes is we can practice things like this. See what kinds of shapes that your brush will give you. See what happens when you place this on, and notice that there's more pigment that pools and how you're going to get some pooling in certain areas and what effects that's going to give you. You could do some strokes like this, change kind of the direction that you're moving your brush. Just get to know how this all moves together. The other thing you can play with is you might find that when you're making stripes, it's easier to do them if you go vertically instead of horizontally. A lot of this is going to be finding what is most comfortable to you. But just kind of get to know what your brush does on this page. Yeah, these totally look like party streamers. Oh my gosh. I never thought about that. The oil resting thing, you can just kind of put some more over it while it's still wet. Other than that, you kind of just have to work around it. It's going to be fine on this page because remember we're practicing. And we're only really going to need a piece that's about this big, so we could just cut a little further over, that type of thing. And then I'm making a video about this. I made a video a little bit ago where I was talking about some assistive or adaptive devices for painting in case you are somebody who is struggling to paint because you've got pain, arthritis, or some sort of disability with your hands. And one of the things that came up in the comments a lot were people who had shaky hands. And this can be from drinking too much coffee or having something like Parkinson's, or just age can kind of cause some shaking in your hands. And I'm working on a video to show you a few different solutions, but one of them that I actually had in my studio from before I made that video is this. This is a piece of an acrylic here, and it kind of sits up on top. It's this bar, so the actual paper is down here and the bar sits here, and so you can actually rest your hand on this bar and you can place your work underneath it and move it around so that you can rest without putting your hand in either what you've painted or depositing oil on your paper. This works for other paintings too, like acrylic and stuff like that. All right, this page, fill it up, get to know your brush, and let's set it to the side again. All right, this is the last one. This is a free-for-all page. Now we're going to use a teal type color. I'm going to modify this one here just because. You finally moving into your bed in here, Goobs? My dog's name is Moogie, but I call her Goobs a lot because she has eye goobers in the morning. And it just kind of stuck. But she's got a really nice dog bed in here, and yet she will never start in the dog bed. She always starts on the floor. All right, so I'm going to modify this green. This is a good way to kind of reuse some of your greens. I'm going to grab some of this blue raspberry. We're making kind of a teal type color, a bluish teal. I'm also going to grab some of this actual teal color, which is Tropical Punch. And you might notice that I don't usually wash my brush when I'm dipping into colors that are kind of similar because it doesn't really affect them that much. But it's probably better to actually wash your brush. But, you know, these are my paints, so I get to do what I want. All right, let's check on what that color looks like. Yes, watercolor. The bar, I think I bought mine on Blick. It's called, but I saw it on Amazon. There's a couple other places. It's called what is it called? A resting bar or a balance bar? I think. I've got a couple other solutions that are I can sneak preview a couple too for grip type things. There's this universal pencil holder that's an egg shape so that you can actually put this on a brush and it's a little more comfortable to hold if you're having trouble with grip. And then, so yeah, I'm going to be, I'll be showing a video of that soon. I shot it yesterday. I'm going to put a little bit of this in there too. And then after I make sure I have all the footage, when I'm doing my editing, this is a nice color. I'm going to go with these colors, with that color for my experimentation page. But as soon as I've made sure I have all the footage, I'm going to send it on to Ashley, who is an artist with a disability on here, and she's going to, I think she's going to make a video with it too, so that she can kind of give her opinions. Like, I'm not currently suffering from any of those things, other than I keep getting pain in this hand from stabilizing my paper here. But other than that, you know, I have to just kind of make general observations. So she's going to give a better take on this. All right, our final one we're doing today is we're going to do whatever you want for the background. On this one, the things I like to experiment with is doing just like one color, because we've been playing with some of the other colors, but to see how much variation you can actually get within a blob, kind of intentionally. But this one is going to just be whatever the background you're going to be using for your final piece. So feel free to experiment with whatever you were wanting to experiment with. Before I start this, let's just address the comments. Is there any questions before we move on to this one? If you're impatient, yeah, hair dryer or heat gun. Heat gun, I'm always nervous about using the heat gun on the paper because I'm like, it could catch on fire. It hasn't. I've been using it for a while now. But the big difference is the heat gun actually is hotter, and then it outputs less air, so it doesn't blow your paints around as much, but a hair dryer works great too on a low speed. Heat gun is always charging over here, constant use. Let's see. Kind of paint. The one I'm using today is my palette, but it's, you know, you can use whatever paint you want. All right. So what I'm going to be playing with here is blooms. I'm going to make just a blob. This does not need to be perfect. I'm going to actually place some of this pigment down, then I'm going to dip into some fresh water, and so in some areas I'm going to get variation. Remember, we're not going for perfection here. We're experimenting. If you, this page you want to do something completely different on, that's totally fine. But I'm just making kind of a blob color. Blob of color. We can also play around with what happens if we overwork this, because sometimes that is really hard not to do. The other thing we can play around here with is some dry brushing. So take your brush kind of on the outsides and then tap it off and be really light about it. See if you can get some of these dry brushing strokes on here, just to get a little bit of play. Don't have to do any of this stuff, but we're just experimenting. And then let's force some bloom. So I'm going to put a little bit of fresh water in my brush, and I'm just going to drop it in. Notice how it's pushing that pigment away. Let's, I want that to be a little smoother there. I don't know why, but I do. And you can get a ton of variation on this page with the one color. Just have a bit of an experiment. Oops, sorry, that was not. I'm gonna leave that like that. That's how I'm gonna have mine here. And actually, I will show you the hair or the heat gun right now because we do need to dry this. because our next thing is we're going to start with our collaging, but I want to make sure this dries. I do want to wait for this for a second before I start drying this. There are a couple puddles right here and right here that I just want to soak in a little bit more if I don't want them to move around at all. If anybody is sensitive to noise, I'm going to be turning this on for about 15 seconds, and I'm going to give you a countdown now so that if you want to, you can turn the volume down, and it's going to be in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, that will be good enough for now because I am going to set this to the side for a bit while we work on compiling our other pieces, which should be dry enough by now, or at least most of the pieces will be dry enough. And let's actually just revisit some of these. I'm going to push this one to the side. Let's grab our little leaves and just take stock of what we have here. I need to find I thought I had my scissors. Oh, here they are, right here. Yeah, this is Michael's, it's their level 1. I always keep a couple pads of this around for experimenting and things like that. It's not by any stretch of the imagination my favorite paper, but it is really cost effective. So if you go through a lot of paper when you're practicing, something like this is good to have on hand because, you know, I see, oops, sorry, I just knocked the camera. I see a lot of watercolor artists saying like, you have to have this kind of paper. You have to have these kind of supplies. And I tend to try to stay away from that type of messaging for a couple reasons. One is not everybody can afford Arches paper. And like my goal is to make art and stuff as accessible as possible. And you can learn to paint with pretty subpar supplies. You can get really good results with them with enough practice and getting to know them. And then there's also this kind of guilt that can sometimes come with using really expensive supplies, which delays your progress because you don't want to use them. You think, well, that pad of paper was $40. I need to be good enough to use it, but then you don't practice, so you can't use it, and then you're never good enough to use the paper that you bought. So my recommendation is to have a few on hand, maybe some that you're not going to feel guilty about. And also just like whatever paper you're going to use is the best paper for you. So if you do find that you just only like using cotton Arches paper, that's totally fine if that's what you're going to use. But if you hear somebody say you have to, in order to learn watercolor, use cotton Arches or something like that, that's not entirely true. Find what works for you, find what's comfortable in your budget as well as just your personal guilt levels. Because I know even I sometimes just keep my Arches paper sitting on the shelf even though I am very used to using art supplies. The only thing I would say when you are selecting a watercolor paper is try to find one that is watercolor. So I noticed in here somebody said school paper. I don't actually know what that is. You can buy even cheaper. Like this is, I recommend 140 pound because it warps a lot less and it's easier to use. But you can go as low as like 90 pound. But I have tried to experiment with like cardstock paper or things like that. And it bleeds all the way through and has really funny effects. Now, you could use those to neat effect, but it's going to be a lot trickier. So I would find something that specifically says watercolor paper so that you can get some of the fun bleeding effects. Oh, thank you, Monica. You're too nice. Five Below has watercolor paper. Nice, nice. I love to hear that. New to watercolor, does tooth or archival properties something you need to learn about? So I think tooth has to do with the texture of the paper. I personally prefer something with more texture than this one. When I'm painting something more serious, I like a little bit of that texture. but you're just going to kind of need to figure out what you like. As far as archival stuff, I also have a kind of a different opinion on this because I paint so much, and I'm not as precious about art. If you are super duper worried about preserving your work over the years, the key thing to it is making sure it's not in direct sunlight, whether that's storing it somewhere where it's covered up or using a UV panel. But I often think about some artwork, not all artwork. Some of my artwork is permanent. Some of the artwork in my home is absolutely permanent. But a lot of these things, you can treat them kind of as seasonal or experimental and then store them away. So, I don't know. I have my watercolor paintings, even from when I was using just like whatever supplies I could find that I stored away, look totally fine. And I don't think that they had any sort of, well, actually, I know they didn't have any sort of archival rating or any sort of protection. So, yeah. All right, so we just need to cut some of these out. I'm just going to go ahead and cut these out. I'm going to be using scissors on the screen if anybody is weird about that. So I am going to be cutting out my favorite leaves, maybe a few of them that I don't care about as much, just to kind of see which ones are going to play nicely together. Yeah, I find, everybody's going to have different things that work for them. And so you might find that saving every single piece of your art is what works for you, and that is totally fine. But if you are really prolific with creating art, you might find that kind of overwhelming. I'm just going to cut these out, by the way, just kind of. And again, that's another thing that for some people that can stop you from creating, because you start to think like, well, I've got so many. Why would I need to paint anything more? And again, that can kind of dull the enjoyment you get out of it. And it can also prevent you from growing your practice. And so, not everything you make, it's totally fine. Not everything you make is going to be delightful. Not everything you're going to make is going to be necessarily worth hanging up. And that is totally fine. There's nothing wrong with occasionally having something that you like temporarily and then moving on. Again, if you want to save everything you've ever made, I'm also totally not judging that. I just know I started making more when I started to kind of let go of some of the things. Yes, where you live is going to play a role in a lot of different things. It can have to do with the supplies you're able to get. It can do with the how long it takes to dry things. It can do with, how much space you have to store things. So that's one of my goals with all my classes, is to teach them in a way that no matter what supplies you're using, you're going to learn at least a couple things, because everybody's going to have different access to different things. Just cutting out some of these shapes. You missed it. Oh no. Well, I will be uploading it, and I still owe you guys the last one. I'm sorry. I think, or did I upload it? Gosh, I need to double check. Again, I apologized earlier. I feel like I'm behind on everything right now. I have a couple big classes coming up. I do classes for like corporate team building things. And so I'm not behind on those, because those are kind of a big priority, because I have a set end date on when I have to make sure everything arrives for those classes, because I send out supply boxes with them. So I've been like heads down doing that, and I feel like I'm falling behind. I don't have as many videos and drafts, and I'm not sure I've uploaded everything to YouTube, as well as my shorts on YouTube have been going crazy lately. And in general, that's fun. but people are not as nice on YouTube as they are on TikTok. I've had people make fun of me for the way I say art. I've had people try to teach me things that are not quite true. I posted the picture. This is the meanest one I've gotten so far, but I posted the picture, the painting of that horse, and somebody wrote, "Nice, you drew a self-portrait," which is, I mean, like, I'm laughing about it now, but at the time it didn't feel very nice. My favorite mean comment I've ever gotten on YouTube was, this is so mean that it actually is funny. They wrote, it was on a painting of one of my, like, dog pictures, which was, it's one that, like, I wasn't unsure. I knew it was a good painting. And they oh, no, I got a raspberry seed. Hold on. Oh, sorry, the raspberry seed's on my uvula. But they wrote, "Your art is bad and you should feel bad." Uh-oh. Hold on, I'm going to step into the hall for a second. Okay, I think I'm better now. There we go. That raspberry seed did not want to go anywhere. Yeah, I know you heard that. Sorry. I'm drinking a smoothie right now, and that raspberry seed really got in there. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to just cut kind of like a square or a rectangle. I do feel like that was the perfect timing, too, for me to talk about that while it sounded like I was choked up. Just pick where you like. I think I'm actually going to pick something kind of like over here because I like the variation of the different strokes. And I'm just going to cut this here. And right here. Yeah, I like YouTube, and there are nice people on YouTube, don't get me wrong. There are some very nice people on YouTube too. But the comments on YouTube make me feel really thankful for the community we have here on TikTok, which is way nicer. So here we go. I got my little planter. It doesn't need to be perfect. You know, we're making a collage. And let's just make sure we got enough of these leaves that are going to work, because we're just going to be gluing them. Oh my god, it's already cute. It's already so cute. Yeah, the rest of TikTok can definitely vary. I'm mainly on art TikTok, though. Oh, speaking of art TikTok being super nice, I don't know if anybody is familiar with Snaily Po, but she's an artist on here, and she has started something called the Do Good Collective, and occasionally I think I'm going to help them post little videos to advertise some of their fundraisers and things. They've got one going on right now, so if you're interested in checking them out or checking Snaily Po out, you should check her work out. She's pretty cool. All right, now I'm just going to glue these down. Oh man, that raspberry seed has left me with a throat tickle. It's like my worst nightmare is being on live and choking on something, so I have to cough it out. I'm just going to play around with the placement of these until I kind of like how they look. You don't have to use all of them either. Like, I think that one might be a little too big. Let's put a little one there. That'll be cute. Oh, hi, Annie. How are you? You're watching this while getting a pedicure. That sounds nice and relaxing. All right, so I'm going to just go ahead and start to kind of glue these down in general. This is the tricky part, making sure that they're not too separated. I'm just using some, I don't know, this is a glue pen I've had for years. Dual tip. It doesn't even... Oh, the Paper Studio, in case you're curious. You've been watching. Nice. I hope that you enjoy watercolor too. It's fun. I think, Annie, you do a lot of like clay stuff, right? You painted the Baby Yoda yesterday. That one was fun to do. Nice. All right, I'm gonna glue these down. This would make such a cute card. You are totally right. Also, if you're like 90% on a painting, one of the best things you can do for a painting, I think I'm gonna slide this one in the back here. If you're like, it's pretty nice, but it's not quite there, put it in a frame. That'll bring it up to that 100%. Okay, I'm gonna glue that down. I love it so much. Now I just need to wait for that. You can always put something heavy on this. You started painting 2 months today? Nice. All right, any last questions? I think I'm done for the day if you guys don't have any other questions, because I'm doing something. I'm gonna go get eyelash extensions, and I don't know if I'm gonna like it, but I'm gonna try something new, because then I don't have to put on as much makeup. I have a feeling I'm not gonna like it or be able to upkeep it, and I'm just going to end up going back to my old routine. Crochet, making zines, nice. Oh, the journal. Yes, yes, yes. Okay, so I was talking about this earlier. I took this class. I actually kind of talked about this, I think, the last time I was on live. It was a class, I think it was by Art by Suzanne. And she did a lot of like florally type things. But she was talking about making a journal where you just made as many pretty pages as you can. Oh, wait, this is my other one. That's not the one. Let me find it. Here we go. In this one, I'm doing a lot of experimenting. I think I showed you guys a couple of these last time. So this is when I... This one was one where I kind of followed along with what she was doing, but she does a lot of mixed media pieces. But her idea was just to like fill each page with something beautiful. So like this one had acrylic paint. It has some watercolor on it. It has metallic marker. It has some of those gelatos. It has, I think, some colored pencil on there too. And this one has a similar type thing. But then I started to experiment more with watercolor backgrounds first. So I've got watercolor down here, and then you can see some of the watercolor there and there. And then I layered on acrylic as well as some of the other types of mediums. And you can also even, like, while the acrylic is wet, you can scratch into it, which is kind of fun to do. This one, again, has some watercolor. You can see the metallics are watercolor. The background is watercolor. And then it's got a bunch of acrylics on here. I was trying to play around with monochromatic. These two I think I'm going to paint over. I don't really like either of those ones. But then, yeah, watercolor background. We've got some crayon, acrylic paint, and then this is obviously when I was super excited about oil. And then I'm just going to kind of keep moving. I've prepared my next watercolor background. So you can definitely play. I haven't done any sort of pastels on top because I also don't think I have any pastels. I think I got rid of those because they were too messy for me. But you can play with mixing a whole bunch of mediums. So yeah. Anyways, I hope that you guys have an absolutely wonderful day, and I'm going to head out. I hope that you had fun, and I will see you guys in 2 weeks. Thank you for joining me today.